like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I get enough.
Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into something pretty cool today. The history of the English language.
It's a fascinating story, really.
It is. We're going to be using excerpts from, let me see, the Wikipedia article, History of English, and we're going to trace the evolution of English.
Oh, absolutely.
From its humble beginnings as Proto-English to becoming the global powerhouse it is today.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize how much English has changed over the centuries.
Right. So to kick things off, let's go back to the very start. Proto-English. Where did it even come from?
Well, you got to picture Northern Europe, right? It was teeming with all these Germanic tribes.
Okay, so like migrations of these tribes to Britain.
You'd think so, but it wasn't quite that simple. You see, some of these tribes were already in Britain.
Really?
Yep. Even before those big migrations started, they'd settled under Roman rule.
Ah, so there were already some Germanic influences bubbling under the surface.
Exactly, and we get glimpses of these early times from things like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle.
Right, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. But isn't it known for not always being perfectly accurate?
You got it. It's a bit like trying to assemble a puzzle with some pieces missing, you know?
I can imagine. So these early settlers brought their own dialects, right?
They did. The Anglo-Saxons, they spoke a bunch of different Ingvaeonic dialects, part of the West Germanic branch of languages.
Okay, so what happened to the languages that were already in Britain?
Well, over time, those Ingvaeonic dialects, they kind of replaced the native Celtic languages.
Oh, wow. So the whole linguistic landscape of Britain just transformed.
Pretty much. It was this slow process of assimilation. Celtic languages, they eventually faded from everyday use in most of England.
That's incredible. So we've got this Proto-English forming. Were there any other influences at play, even in those early days?
Well, even back then, Proto-English, believe it or not, was borrowing words from Latin.
Huh. Why was that?
Think about it. The Roman Empire, they'd been in Britain and Latin. Well, that was the language of administration, culture, you know the deal.
Right, right. So even way back then, English was already this mix of influences.
Exactly. And it didn't stop there.
Okay, so these Ingvaeonic dialects, they morph into what we call Old English, right?
Right. Think of it this way. Those dialects, they were like siblings in a family.
Okay.
Shared traits, but each with its own personality. By around 450 AD, they developed into Old English. And just like in any family, you had the prominent members, right?
Uh-huh. So who are we talking about?
Well, you had Mercian, Northumbrian, Kentish, and then the big one, the most influential, West Saxon.
West Saxon. That was King Alfred's favorite, wasn't it?
You know it. King Alfred the Great, the one who ruled Wessex in the 9th century, he really championed West Saxon as the standard for literature and administration.
Ah, so it became the dominant dialect thanks to him.
Exactly.
Pretty cool. Now, Old English, how was it written? Was it the same alphabet we use today?
Not quite. Initially, they used runes. It's this ancient Germanic writing system called Futhorc.
Runes. I always think of like Vikings and mysterious inscriptions.
Yeah, well, those runes were used for Old English, too.
So how did we get to the Latin alphabet?
Well, Christianity arrives in the 7th century, and with it, the Latin alphabet starts taking over, gradually replaces the runes.
Ah, so that's how it happened.
Yep. And this brings us to a very important piece of literature, Beowulf.
Beowulf, the epic poem.
Exactly.
What makes it so significant for Old English?
Beowulf, it's like a treasure chest. It gives us this amazing insight into the Anglo-Saxon world, their language, culture, values.
It's wild how a single poem can transport you back in time like that.
Isn't it?
And you mentioned Christianity earlier. Did that have a lasting impact on the language beyond just the alphabet?
Oh, absolutely. Christianity brought with it a wave of new words borrowed from Latin.
Like what?
Like priest, paper, even school. All those words entered English during this period.
Wow, so the language was growing and changing because of these cultural shifts.
Exactly. It shows you how language is never really static. It's always evolving.
So we've got Old English chugging along, expanding its vocabulary. But then, history throws us a curveball. The Vikings.
Ah, the Vikings. Those raids, starting around the 8th century, they had a huge GE impact.
Right?
And a surprising one, too.
Surprising. How so?
Well, the Vikings, they spoke Old Norse.
Right.
And Old Norse Well, it wasn't completely foreign to the Anglo-Saxons, linguistically speaking, I mean.
Wait, are you saying Old English and Old Norse had something in common?
They did. They were both Germanic languages.
Huh.
Both descended from a common ancestor, like distant cousins who could still kind of understand each other.
It's amazing. So they had this shared linguistic background, even though they were, fighting each other.
Yep. And this made it easier for words and grammatical structures to jump between the two languages.
Fascinating. So these Viking raids, they actually enriched the language.
Absolutely. We see the influence of Old Norse in so many ways, both in grammar and vocabulary. Take the pronoun they, for example.
They.
Yeah. It actually comes from Old Norse. Replace the Old English high and so many common words. Enger, bag, law, skill, even window comes from Old Norse.
I had no idea.
It's pretty amazing, right? Though I should mention there's still some debate about just how much influence the Vikings had.
Oh.
Yeah, everyone agrees it was significant, but the degree of impact, well, that's still up for debate.
Fascinating. It's like history left us with this linguistic puzzle.
It really is.
And speaking of major turning points, we're heading into Middle English and the Norman Conquest.
Ah, yes. 1066. That's a year that changed everything, both for English history and for the language itself.
It's a game changer for sure.
Yeah.
But to understand its impact, we need to talk about Anglo-Norman.
Anglo-Norman.
What exactly was that? I'm not familiar with that term.
Picture this. The Normans, they come from what's now France, right?
Mhm.
They conquer England, and they bring their language, a dialect of Old French called Norman.
Okay.
And this Norman French, it mixes with Old English and develops into what we call Anglo-Norman.
So it's like a fusion language, born out of conquest.
Pretty much. But did everyone in England suddenly start speaking Anglo-Norman? Not quite.
Who spoke it then?
It became the language of the elite, the ruling class, the courts.
Was it like a language of power?
Exactly. While English, well, that became associated with the common people, was like a linguistic class divide had emerged.
Wow, a tale of two languages within one kingdom.
You got it. And this linguistic power struggle had a big impact on how English developed.
So did English manage to survive under Anglo-Norman rule?
It did, but not without going through some major changes. English, it was no longer the language of power, but it was the language of the people. And it continued to evolve, adapt, and you know what? It even started borrowing from Anglo-Norman.
Really? How much did it borrow?
A lot, actually. Believe it or not, almost 30% of modern English words come from French.
No way.
Yeah, it's a testament to the legacy of the Norman conquest.
Man.
Think about it. All those French words you might struggle to pronounce, they're already a part of your vocabulary.
So what kind of words were borrowed from Anglo-Norman?
All sorts. Words related to government, like parliament or justice.
Great.
Words related to the church, like religion or prayer.
Mm-hmm.
Words related to law, like court or judge. Military terms like army and soldier.
Wow, that's a lot.
And it goes beyond that. Even words for fashion, like dress and beauty, or food words like beef and dinner, all influenced by Anglo-Norman French.
It's like the Normans brought their culture, their food, and their language, and English just absorbed it all.
Exactly. And it wasn't just vocabulary. Anglo-Norman had an impact on grammar, too.
Oh, how so?
Well, Middle English, that's what we call this language that emerged from this fusion, right? It started to simplify things. Cases and genders, they got less complex. And plural nouns, instead of the Old English N ending, they started to favor S.
Oh, like children versus child.
Yeah. Though we still see remnants of that older N form, like in children, oxen. And one of the most notable changes, the definite article the, emerged as a distinct word.
So Middle English was really developing its own character.
It was, and even spelling was influenced. Those Norman spelling conventions, they had a lasting impact.
Really? Like what?
For instance, the sounds we represent with the this, they replaced those old English letters, thorn and F. Can you imagine trying to text with those today?
Huh. That would be tricky. Thank goodness for the Normans.
Right.
And speaking of Middle English, we can't forget Geoffrey Chaucer. His Canterbury Tales, it's a classic.
Absolutely. The Canterbury Tales, it's a perfect example of Middle English literature. These stories told by a group of pilgrims on their way to Canterbury.
I love how it gives you a glimpse into the lives of everyday people.
Yeah, it's full of vivid characters, humor, social commentary, and the language is surprisingly accessible, even for us today.
It's like history brought to life through words. But, the story of English doesn't end there. Get ready for some vowel action, because next up, it's early modern English.
Ah, yes. Early modern English, the era that gave us Shakespeare
Shakespeare?
and a whole bunch of linguistic innovations.
Sounds exciting. I'm ready for more.
Well, we'll have to save that for the next part of our deep dive. So early modern English, that takes us from, let's say, 1500 to 1700. And this is where things start to sound a little more like the English we speak today.
So, like, if we hopped in a time machine, went back to Shakespeare's London, could we understand what people were saying?
Well, you'd probably feel like you were listening to a slightly odd dialect.
Okay.
Understandable, but definitely some differences. One of the big changes was something called the Great Vowel Shift.
The Great Vowel Shift. Vowels going on an adventure.
Basically, it was a whole series of pronunciation shifts that affected long vowels. So words like bite or house.
Yeah.
Their vowel sounds, they changed quite a bit during this time. That's why those words sound different now than they did back in Middle English.
So that's why Shakespeare sounds so, well, Shakespearean.
Yeah.
But amidst all these pronunciation shifts, how did English spelling become more, standardized?
Well, that's where the printing press comes in. William Caxton, the first English printer, he had a lot to do with that.
Oh, right, Caxton.
He really helped establish a more uniform way of writing English. And this, well, it kind of solidified the language, paved the way for writers like Shakespeare.
Shakespeare. Speaking of, didn't he invent a ton of new words?
He was definitely inventive, but he wasn't the only one.
Oh.
The Renaissance was happening, remember? This explosion of new ideas, discoveries, and all that.
Right, the Renaissance.
So you had all these scholars rediscovering classical texts, Greek and Roman stuff, and that led to a huge influx of new words borrowed from Latin and Greek.
Like a linguistic renaissance happening right alongside the artistic and cultural one.
Precisely. Words like, democracy, atmosphere, even skeleton. They were all adopted during this period to describe these new concepts.
Wow, English was really expanding its vocabulary to keep up with all this new knowledge.
It had to.
Did any of those regional dialects we talked about earlier survive alongside this increasingly standardized English?
You bet. The London dialect, it was becoming more prominent thanks to the court and the printing press, But those regional dialects, they kept evolving too,
Right.
often holding on to those older pronunciations and adding their own little twists to the language.
So the seeds of those diverse accents we hear today were already being sown.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But we're moving along in history.
Yeah.
Now we're getting into modern English from about 1700 to the present day. It's amazing how far we've come already.
It's a wild ride.
Yeah.
And we're not done yet.
Nope. And to usher us into this era of modern English, who better than Samuel Johnson, right? With his famous dictionary published in 1755.
Oh, yeah. Johnson's dictionary. Didn't it take him like 9 years to finish?
Something like that. Talk about dedication.
It's incredible. What made his dictionary so groundbreaking for the development of English?
It wasn't just a list of words, Johnson, he wanted to standardize English spelling and usage. He wanted to create this definitive guide, a benchmark for clarity and consistency.
So he tried to bring order to the chaos of the English language.
In a way, yes. And you know what? His work still has a huge influence on how we understand and use English today.
Wow. But even with dictionaries and standardization,
Yeah.
languages never really stop evolving, do they?
You're absolutely right. Languages, they're like living organisms. They're always adapting.
Especially in response to all those changes happening in the world.
Exactly. And modern English, well, it's seen its fair share of those. The Industrial Revolution, globalization, all of that has had an impact.
It's mind-boggling to think about how much the dictionary must have grown since Johnson's time.
I know, right? Technology, science, culture, it's all constantly evolving, adding new words and expressions to the language.
It's incredible how much English has changed over the centuries, and how it continues to change even today.
It really is. Especially now in the digital age, the internet, it's like this breeding ground for new words and ways of communicating.
So from those early Germanic dialects spoken by tribes to the global language of the internet, it's quite a journey.
And it's not over yet. English keeps adapting, borrowing, reinventing itself.
It really reflects how interconnected our world has become. But you know what? This global reach of English leads us to another fascinating chapter. The emergence of all these different varieties of English around the world.
It's a whole other story.
It is. But before we jump into that, let's take a moment to appreciate everything we've learned about the history of English so far. It really is amazing when you think about it, how all those simple words and phrases spoken by our ancestors, they turn into this incredibly complex language that we have today.
And it connects billions of people worldwide.
Right, from those Proto-Germanic roots to being this global lingua franca, it's been quite a journey.
It really underscores how language isn't this fixed thing. It's constantly evolving.
Yeah, reflecting the cultures and experiences of all its speakers.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen how English, it's just so adaptable, soaking up influences from all these different languages and cultures.
Exactly. Invasions, migrations, cultural exchanges, all of them have shaped English, left their mark. It's like this tapestry woven from all these different threads.
But here we are now in the digital age. What does the future hold for English?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It makes you wonder how things like globalization and all this online communication will shape how the language continues to evolve.
For sure. Will it keep changing as quickly as it has in the past?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And will we see like completely new dialects emerging online? Or maybe even like a fusion of different varieties of English?
It's definitely a possibility. Think about it. The internet's created all these new ways for people to connect and share language. We're already seeing new slang popping up online, and different languages are being blended together in online communities. And then you have all those new ways of communicating, like with emojis and memes.
It's mind-blowing when you think about all that potential for like linguistic creativity. But do you think all this change could lead to English, like fragmenting into completely separate languages? Sort of like what happened with Latin centuries ago.
That's something linguists have been thinking about a lot. It's possible, but we also have to consider all the factors that are bringing people together. English is this lingua franca, this common language for communication across the globe. And then you've got things like machine translation, which could actually help bridge the gaps between languages.
So it's possible that the future of English will be this kind of balancing act. Diversification on one hand, but also a push for unity on the other.
Exactly. And the crazy thing is, we're watching it all happen right now.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes to how much English has changed and is still changing.
I know, right? It's fascinating. And for anyone listening out there, I encourage you to keep exploring the world of language.
Yes.
Dig deeper into the history of English, find out where your favorite words came from, and just be amazed by how languages evolve and interact with each other.
It's an adventure that never really ends. We've only scratched the surface here, but I hope it's made everyone curious to learn more.
Me too.
So, until next time, keep those linguistic gears turning.
Sound the alarm. I'm coming up. We'll have a ball. I'm sweet like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I get enough.